Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a New Republic live stream event, where our focus tonight will be on how to govern our way out of the Trump era. My name is Jason Linkins. I'm a deputy editor in charge of the Soapbox, which is the New Republic section on daily national politics at newrepublic.com. Normally, we do these events live and in person. Obviously, the ongoing pandemic is keeping us from sharing a room together. But just to focus on the positive, I'm very thankful to invite all of you into this virtual room, into my home for tonight's discussion. And tonight, our focus is on the path ahead for this country and how to get us all unstuck from the Trump era. I'm using the phrase the Trump era to largely suggest merely a moment in time that's passing. Because while the past 4 years have certainly been a long period of misrule, many of the durable problems we face weren't invented by President Donald Trump. They weren't born in the last 4 years. Many of the challenges we face in terms of governance lie far from Capitol Hill. And it's very likely that much of the energy and direction that we're going to need to get the country back on the right track may not come from the halls of power at all, but rather from political movements at street level, our fellow citizens, perhaps one another. So it's a broad remit. It's going to be a real challenge to solve all of our problems in the time we have today. Unfortunately, we have tonight what my producer is calling the smartest panel ever assembled. So let's meet them. Feel free to just wave in your Zoom window as I introduce you. First, he is the senior political economy reporter from the Huffington Post and the author of The Price of Peace, Money, Democracy, and the Life of John Maynard Keynes. You probably, of course, know him best as the lead singer of Cataract Camp. Please welcome Zach Carter. He is the founder and director of the Revolving Door Project, which actually has nothing to do with architecture or building egress, but it rather scrutinizes executive branch appointees to ensure that they use their office to serve the broad public interest rather than to entrench corporate power or seek personal advancement. Please welcome Jeff Hauser. She is an attorney and a professor of law at Fordham University and a one-time candidate for the New York State House. Her most recent book is titled Break 'em Up, Recovering Our Freedom from Big Ag, Big Tech, and Big Money. She's forgotten more about government ethics than most of us can ever hope to know. Please welcome Zephyr Teachout. And finally, he is a staff writer for the New Republic who I have rudely dragooned into participating in tonight's panel. So please welcome our friend Osita Nwanevu. Tonight, we're going to be in conversation for about 45 minutes. Then we'll open it up to your questions. You should please enter all of your questions at the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. Hopefully it'll be a lively discussion. I want to just sort of kick off today talking about the fact that obviously events in the past week have reinforced the fact that we have a desperate need for something that we might call a democracy agenda. Something that we implement. Cleo Chang recently wrote a piece for the New Republic that kind of laid this out directly. The need to immediately move to do things like, shore up voting rights, decrease the gap in income inequality. Osita also flicked at in his most recent piece the fact that the need to reaffirm our foundation of democracy is going to take a real life hack to begin with. Several democratic reforms are going to have to be swiftly enacted, and the people that now will step to the fore to govern the country, the Biden administration of Democrats, are going to have to show some firm resolve, just getting the stuff done they need to do the other stuff they need to have firm resolve to do. Zach, you and I we coast a podcast together for a long time. We talked about a lot of this stuff endlessly, and you have a real firm expertise in taking a really awkward introduction that I start with and pivoting into something intelligent. So do you think you could bail me out this time?
I'll do my best, Jason. A democracy agenda is a it's a highfalutin way of saying that the country is in really deep trouble, and if you take self-government seriously, you have to enable people to govern themselves. And I think a lot of the things that we've seen over the last week, for instance, kind of distract from the ways that the Republican Party has been undermining basic democracy in the United States for a couple of decades now. I mean, basic voting rights. We haven't talked about it a lot since the Georgia runoffs, because Democrats won the Georgia runoffs. But the only reason Democrats had to win the Georgia runoffs in this crazy way was because intense voter suppression efforts had been implemented by the very Republican officials who were then hailed as sort of these stalwart, people upholding basic principles of democracy once Donald Trump was trying to overturn the results of the 2020 elections. I mean, Stacey Abrams is not governor of Georgia right now, basically because the Republican Party in Georgia prevented people from voting in 2018. This has been a basic part of the Republican Party playbook for a very long time. And it's not a secret. I mean, everybody knows Republicans see Black voters as Democratic voters, and they do what they can to keep Black voters from voting. It's really pretty simple. They also try to keep poor people from voting. And for a long time, they've been trying to keep immigrants, children of immigrants from voting as well, although it's not obvious that the immigration sort of demographic is breaking for Democrats the way I think they had hoped in 2020. But regardless, it's really obvious that there's a huge voter suppression problem in the United States. You can deal with that in a couple of ways if you're the Democratic Party and you care about power. I mean, one is to just pass a bill making it easy to vote. A lot of ways that it can be easy to vote. I mean, you can vote by mail. You can talk about the COVID pandemic and say, look, this is a thing that happened. We did this. It pretty much worked. The people who said it didn't work were big liars and then came to the Capitol and beat a Capitol Hill police officer to death with a fire extinguisher. Everybody should be able to vote by mail. That makes it harder for local Republican officials to keep people from voting. But the Republican Party is not just going to stop doing this stuff. One of the strange things I think over the past 10, 15 years is that the party has recognized that it has a demographic problem. And instead of adjusting and trying to appeal to demographics other than what is essentially the Trump base, they've doubled down on xenophobia and on racism and done so while simultaneously attacking low-income, moderate-income people with the economic policies of plutocrats. So and largely not, let's face it, like not faced a huge electoral backlash for the sort of class-based, the class warfare that they've been doing. So I do think Democrats long-term face a challenge here if they're not going to shore up the ability for people to vote in a democracy. It's a huge problem. But there are all these other things that happen too. I mean, you have the potential for statehood for DC or for Puerto Rico. To be perfectly frank, I find it really hard to imagine the Democratic Party going hard on any of these things right now. I hope they do, but I see the Biden administration being very ambitious on something like fiscal policy before they would go hard on voting rights, unfortunately.
Well, that's one of the other product of what the Republican Party has achieved has been sort of a raw desire to exert maximal power at all times, even when it doesn't necessarily make sense on the policy front. This is a party that spent a decade trying and sort of flamboyantly failing to repeal and replace Obamacare, and they've never acted like there was any cost to be paid for it. Osita, when you think about the Democratic Party and their willingness to exert maximal power, I personally find it to be often lacking. Is now the time where they have to sort of lace up their boots and get cracking?
Yeah, absolutely. This is they have a very narrow window of opportunity here, I think, between now and 2022 to get us on the right track when it comes to things like voting rights, when it comes to structural reforms that empower the Democratic Party and disempower the Republican Party. To my mind, last week should have been a huge wake-up call. And the question facing the Democratic Party now is, do you allow a political party that would feed into what happened on Wednesday to accrue structural power or not? The way things are, I mean, as it stands right now, in the United States Senate, a minority of the country controls the vast majority of the seats. If population trends continue on their current trajectory, by 2040, the most conservative 30% of the country is going to control 70% of the seats itself. That's disaster for not only the Democratic Party, but for the country. If you assume that the Republican Party isn't going to have this sort of come to Jesus moment and become sane and all these things, that's a real problem, especially if you care about passing laws that will prevent climate change and healthcare bills and all the things that progressives want. So, what we have over the next couple of months is going to be a real, it's going to be increasingly difficult over time for Democrats to have as much control over the federal government as they are going to have. It's going to be harder to win the Senate. It's going to be harder to keep the House if Republicans succeed in gerrymandering in this new census. And it's going to be harder to win the presidency given the Electoral College. So it's really, up to them in this next 100 days, however much time you want to call it, to really make good use of it. And I don't know that they will. You're right, that when push comes to shove, Democrats, I think at most can be counted on to do anywhere from a fourth to an eighth to a fourth of the right thing, if you push really, really hard. But there's some hope in the fact that last year at John Lewis's funeral, Barack Obama came out and said, look, if we really care about voting rights and Republicans block it, that means we have to get rid of the filibuster, right? The Senate as it's currently operating is not tenable. You have all kinds of people who are not activists and hair on fire progressives like myself who like work at Harvard Law School and all these things, who were saying like, look, we have to think about structurally redesigning, reforming the system. Otherwise, we're going to lose the ability to even, ambitiously call what we have in America today a democracy. That's going to go away. And I think that the events of last week make that especially clear. I don't think Democrats can be relied upon to sort of come to that conclusion themselves. I think that if there's any hope, it's going to come from activists from below, really pressuring people like Joe Manchin, like Kirsten Sinema, and making it seem like they might lose re-election if they don't come on board with some of this stuff. Because I don't think there's any hope whatsoever of the leadership of the Democratic Party in and of itself sort of finding it within its own power to back these things. It's going to have to be the product of progressive activism.
We're going to talk a little bit about this sort of like recentering power later on in the thing. One of the other big projects that we have to deal with is, of course, the ongoing pandemic and steering way out of it. This is something that obviously has been a storied failure at the federal level, but it's also been not a minor failure at the state level. Zephyr, within recent memory, you've contemplated actually running the state of New York. This is one of the states that I think has really done a very poor job at managing its way out of the pandemic. And it's kind of a government crisis too. As someone from the perspective, someone who has that perspective of like contemplating getting into the weeds of governance at that level, do you see similar sort of like a problem of diffidence, or is it a problem of competence at that level?
Wow, I have a lot of thoughts about Andrew Cuomo.
Of course, naturally.
And I don't want to derail it. I think it's fundamentally at heart, and then I want to return to the sort of broader moment, a problem of radical need to centralize power. And different people face different forms of corruption. For many, it's money, and Andrew Cuomo certainly is close to many donors, but he also has an aggressive ongoing need to be in control. And some of the real recent tragedies in terms of failure to use vaccines have been a direct result of that control. I do, if you don't mind, want to just chime in very briefly on the democracy point. Because
absolutely.
Because I think it's so important, and it is also something that needs to be happening at the state level. So we'll talk later about grassroots, but there's grassroots, and then there's also state action, especially in blue states, which actually can be very important in pushing and dynamically interacting with the federal Congress. For decades, progressives effectively relied on the Supreme Court and promise of constitutional protections as the primary means through which voting rights and democratic rights were could be protected. And right now we have a Supreme Court that is openly hostile to both voting rights, 5 justices to the right of Roberts, who gutted the Voting Rights Act, and openly hostile to anti-corruption laws, Citizens United being one of many cases in which the Supreme Court has shown itself to be very aggressively opposed to pro-democracy laws. What that means is not that there's no opportunities, but that it is especially incumbent upon Biden and the Congress and the Senate to push forward the kinds of pro-democracy reforms we were talking about earlier. And there has been a lot of work in the last 6 years, in particular on HR 1, the bill in Congress, bringing together what had been 2 really different worlds, unfortunately, voting rights activists and money in politics activists. And HR 1, which has gained on paper overwhelming support, including support of leadership, would address gerrymandering, making it easier to vote, introducing a new Voting Rights Act, which is absolutely urgent at this moment, and changing the way that we fund elections. And I think it is a heavy lift for any Congress that is used to their own method of fundraising. And although there are many new members who fundraised off low dollars, most of them are still used to the old dialing for $2,000, $5,000. But if they are able to rise to this moment, and if Biden and leadership can lay out a vision of what democracy can be like, this is a quasi-constitutional moment. The level of anxiety, paranoia, distrust is at extraordinarily high levels, and the future has always played an important, has always had an important impact on the present. So Biden laying out a vision of what a democracy can look like, where people feel like they have more power, are not subject to big money sort of drowning out their voices. I think that's very powerful, and I also think it'll be very powerful for Biden taking the mantle of that, which very early in his career, many decades ago, he really pushed for campaign finance reform. So there's somewhere in there that he can really be a leader on that. And I actually think it would do a lot for building trust and excitement and energy if he promises, if he doesn't look back to 2010, but looks forward to a more democratic future than one we have ever had.
Jeff, you and your colleagues have been holding a microscope up to Biden as he's begun this transition. And, you know, we have a saying, it's personnel is policy. I think you have sort of at least a bird's eye view of the kind of personnel he's bringing on. If you had to guess about, you know, whether this administration was going to have the gumption to do these big things, how would you evaluate that?
I think I am mildly optimistic, but mild optimism is, you know, not the strongest force compared to the obstacles that the Biden administration is facing. I mean, Biden is literally, I think, taking over at the hardest time to become president. If you combine the rise of international fascism, a pandemic, an economic mess, a racial reckoning, a coup. I mean, it's a genuinely difficult job. And I think he is assembling a pretty good team. I was encouraged today to see that Gary Gensler is likely to be the SEC commissioner, and having an SEC commissioner who thinks that breaking the rules and the laws is a bad thing would be a revolutionary step. I think connecting the conversation about democracy, I want to tie it back to just rule of law generally and say that the weirdest pick, Merrick Garland for Attorney General, which, I mean, I still have not fully wrapped my head around the kind of non sequitur of what question does Merrick Garland answer other than like a Jeopardy question about nominees to never get a vote. I mean, it turns out Merrick Garland is probably the most important person in this administration, or he's going to like delegate the power downward, in which case we're going to have a lot of U.S. attorneys or special counsels who are going to be supremely important. But I think we need to return to the notion of accountability, that powerful people have to follow the rule of law. I think that in 2000, Jeb Bush, Katherine Harris, and the whole crew down in Florida didn't have to follow the rule. They purged a lot of voters. They did all sorts of stuff. They stole one election successfully. In 2008, we saw the financial crisis hit. We saw a lot of people commit crimes. They got away with it. We need to turn back to a sense, you can't have democracy setting rules and setting laws collectively. That doesn't mean anything if the rules and laws don't apply to everyone, if equal justice under law is not a real thing. So oddly, maybe the other most encouraging news of the day is that Rick Snyder is going to be facing prosecution for his role in the Flint water crisis. That is the type of thing I believe a Biden administration, the opportunity that they have, that they can be fighting on very basic points. We are the people who think your mail should get delivered, and we will prosecute people who got in the way of your mail being delivered. We think that COVID tests should be distributed equally, and CEOs who cut the line are going to get prosecuted. We believe antitrust laws should be prosecuted, civil rights laws. All of the laws matter. And I am increasingly mildly, small amounts optimistic, but we are going to be vigilant. But I think it's really all about, are the people Biden puts in place going to implement the laws and missions of these agencies and departments as they're written? It doesn't require radical progressives to do something that would be radical and very progressive for this country, which is to reinstate equal justice under law.
One of the things, of course, that gets in the way of implementing a big agenda is not just the personnel that may or may not be willing to do what's right, but Congress as well. There's already been a lot of talk about how a lot of people have kicked around the idea that now Joe Manchin runs Washington. There's been an emerging sort of like weird bipartisan gang, if you remember how important gangs were to the Obama administration. I got news for you. There are more on the way, apparently. But, besides perhaps Biden finding his killer instinct, and I will remind that Democrats did just get through a Georgia runoff where their explicit promise was, vote for us, we'll give you $2,000. That's pretty unique for Democrats to just sort of like, we're the party of free money now. They usually run scared from that kind of thing. Joe Manchin apparently has perhaps been made to back down on his threat to not go through with it. Can that kind of pressure be put on the actual members of the Democratic caucus to pass what Biden has at times claimed he wants to have, like an FDR-sized agenda, just free for all? Who wants to grab it?
I'll jump in here. I think yes. I honestly, the entire Senate Democratic caucus got behind the $2,000 checks. As a policy idea, before Biden was talking about it as a campaign idea in Georgia. I think we're going to get the $2,000 checks. I think we're going to get a very big, bold fiscal agenda, and I think they have a great opportunity to pass it. There are a lot of Republicans who like some of these things for their constituents, and they don't actually need Republican votes to pass a huge fiscal package. You can do this through reconciliation with 50 votes and Kamala Harris. And sure, Joe Manchin will demand a pound of flesh. So just demand one extra pound of flesh from your opening bid. This is something the Obama administration never really understood about how to negotiate with his own caucus, was that they want to be seen taking you down a peg. They don't want to be seen destroying your agenda. So just aim a little bit higher, and yeah, okay, give Joe Manchin, tell him that he can't have 7 extra national parks in West Virginia. He can only have 6. There's an enormous amount of room here for an FDR style agenda, and to some extent, I think that conflicts with some of the goals that Zephyr and Osita and Jeff were talking about here. We don't talk about it that much with the FDR sort of era of the New Deal, but FDR was not exactly like this huge anti-corruption guy who was cracking down on all these different Democratic machines and Democratic patronage throughout the party and the country. He spent an enormous amount of money, some of it not terribly efficiently, just to get the money out the door, and he sort of let the corruption stuff work itself out, oftentimes not work itself out. So I think there's a risk here with the Biden administration, actually, that by doing a really big fiscal package, he'll ignore some of the corporate reforms that need to be done. I think Silicon Valley really jumps out as the area where we really, really need to do something very quickly that relates to the democracy agenda. If you can't have an information ecosystem that is responsible and I won't say anti-fascist, because I guess that's become a problematic word now politically, but non-fascist. The business models of these companies are basically, based on pumping out hard right extremism. That's a huge problem. Something needs to be done about that. And you actually can't spend your way out of that problem. But you can spend your way out of a lot of other problems and a lot of other social misery. And you can use reconciliation to go after climate, to do something about healthcare. There's quite a lot that can be done with 50 votes. And Joe Biden talking about the need to spend trillions of dollars. I mean, this reflects a genuine change in the intellectual consensus within the economics profession about whether deficits are good or bad, or not that big a deal. And frankly, like, the Democratic Party has been fighting that shift for like 25 years. It's been happening slowly, but I mean, Biden is now pretty clearly, if you just paid attention a couple of weeks ago on the $2,000 check issue, you had Tom Friedman, Larry Summers, and to a lesser extent, Paul Krugman, wringing their hands about the horrors of $2,000 checks. And Joe Biden told him to go all stuff it. Like, I mean, I didn't see that coming in the primary. I didn't see that Joe Biden. And I think that shows actually some political acumen.
I think it was such a critical political moment, that shift. And I just want to clarify something about the democracy agenda and piggyback, is that what we're talking about is how Congress's elections are funded, which people across the country hate. They hate big money in politics. And it's something that is politically popular and you can push forward, that is not about efficiency in distributing vaccines, which, by the way, is part of what got one of many problems with Cuomo, but part of what got Cuomo in trouble is he said, I only want people who I have personally inspected to get vaccines. That level of control is extremely dangerous when you have a crisis of this level. And pushing stuff out the door is very exciting. I just want to piggyback on what you're saying about big tech and what Jeff was saying about taking on powerful actors. There's an enormous political moment that is just sort of waiting to be seized. It's teed up by David Cicilline and the Antitrust House Subcommittee's extraordinary 450-page report that is really bold. And they have a lot of, got Pramila Jayapal on that committee, but you also have many more centrist Democrats there. Republicans weren't totally opposed to parts of it. You have this massive, well-researched report with the support of the Justice, with the support of Nadler. And basically brought, signs of leadership support. And then on the ground, left and right, Republicans and Democrats are sick of big tech, not just for the reasons you were talking about, which are horrific, the way that we have a communications infrastructure that is built on a business model of toxicity, but also because your mom and pop stores are shoveling over all the extra cash they have for the inflated ad costs of Facebook and Google, and they feel like they have no choice. And so at a moment when local communities are just in devastating shape, urban and rural, saying, hey, I, Biden, am going to use the full power of the Department of Justice to take on these, big corporate thieves, that would be such a jolt. That would be a jolt like incredible relief to say, oh no, this is a Democratic Party that's going to take on the middlemen and stand up for the little guy. And then on the congressional level, you can also push to move through the agenda in the Senate. I'm not saying it'll be easy, but there's so much anger out there. And I think accurately targeted anger at big companies that are getting away like bandits right now, regardless of their impact. With the rule of law going after those companies, that's a real political opportunity, but also something really necessary for rebalancing power in our society.
And just quickly on the FDR point, and obviously I very much recommend Zachary Carter's great book on Keynes, which talks a lot about the FDR and goes into the FDR administration, goes into it in great detail. But you can't really tell a story of FDR without looking at his antitrust enforcement, how the Security and Exchange Commission originally had Joe Kennedy in charge. It turned out he didn't actually do very well, so they pushed him out after barely more than a year, and then they started actually enforcing the brand new securities laws. So there was a lot of enforcement of anti-corruption type principles, even as, they didn't take on Democratic big city machines. And they even had a modus vivendi with some of the Republican machines that existed. And that's fine. Like no one's talking about a puritanical take that ends all politics in politics. We're not going to end politics in politics. But I also want to mention two of the congressional centered commissions that took place bookending the FDR years. The Pecora Commission at the beginning went after Wall Street, and then the Truman Commission at the end went after the military-industrial complex and how he was looking into World War II and the defense spending and trying to make sure there was not excessive profiteering. And it was so popular that Harry Truman, a backbencher from Missouri, became vice president and ultimately president of the United States. So we would urge not only the Biden administration to enforce laws seriously, pick fights with corporate fat cats who are unpopular, and implement rule of law. We would also urge, a la David Cicilline and the House Judiciary Committee, we would urge Congress to realize that their ambitions as members and as a body can be realized by serious oversight.
Just just because Jeff is talking about FDR and I can't stop. I mean, it's also important to note that like when FDR was cracking down on banking trusts and corporate fat cats, that was to his political advantage. He was attacking his political enemies, and it was popular publicly, and it also undercut the financial and organizational base of his political opponents. It was smart politics, and there's no reason not to do that with big tech today when they have spent the last 4 or 5 years fomenting fascism in the United States and around the world.
Osita, I'll let you jump on this topic too, but I also want to just put to you that one of the things that I think has been very resonant throughout a lot of your recent work is this sort of like prediction that it's going to take, at least on some level, direct action from actual citizens, really forceful centers of power emerging elsewhere besides outside of Washington to get anything done, whether it's through pressuring people in Congress to act or moving the needle on issues that matter the most, like climate change.
Yeah, and that's it's not a new take, but it's an important one. I actually was speaking with Ezra Levin of Indivisible today for a piece I'm working on about the Senate and the filibuster, and talking with him about what they plan to do in their chapters. There's going to be a lot of, I think, grassroots mobilization on democracy reform in particular over the next couple of months. And it's not just going to be, the groups like Indivisible and people who've been talking about this for a long time, but I think that you're seeing increasingly a lot of progressive interest groups, whether that's Sunrise on climate, whether that's Everytown on guns, whether that's the immigration groups. They all understand that the importance of having a procedural shift here in the Senate. That is going to be the hitch that determines whether or not any of their priorities get pushed. You have the unions also engaged in this as well. So, I think that there's going to be a lot of action underneath, and it's going to be, a matter of doing a lot of really sort of boring civic school stuff, like a lot of people calling their senators representatives and sending letters, and now using social media and sort of making this issue real and live, and making people feel like there's a groundswell asking them to change things here. One of the big encouraging moments I remember early in the Trump administration was there's like a first wave of people going back and meeting their constituents. And people were trying to push like Sheldon Whitehouse on something. I can't remember what it was exactly, but there was this moment where people were going to their town halls and saying, look, like you're not doing enough to really stand against Trump. I think it was a period where he was trying to get through his cabinet picks, right? There were people who were very, very angry that Democrats were voting and approving some of his cabinet picks. They went in and pushed people. And you saw, I think, a shift in this approach of Senate Democrats as a consequence of people literally just getting in people's faces and saying, you can't continue to do this. That's what it's going to take. Again, I think it's encouraging that we see from Democratic leadership things like HR 1, like Zephyr was talking about. That's a big, important bill. I think it's a good thing that you have people like Barack Obama coming in and saying that we need to think about structural reforms. At the same time, over the next couple of months, we're going to see people like Tom Daschle rise from the coffin like Dracula, as he did today, from wherever he's been, and sort of urge the opposite approach and saying, no, what we need now is some grander reconciliation, working with Republicans, trying to do the gangs and see if we can implement policy that way. None of the big things people have been worried about, none of the big things that Joe Biden himself has promised are actually going to happen that way. It's going to be through pushing things through reconciliation and things that can't fit through reconciliation because there's the Byrd rule and certain things that you can't really do through that process. It's going to be either reconciliation or getting rid of the filibuster. And securing the gains that we make is going to take, I think, reforms like adding seats to the Supreme Court, adding states, things that make the democratic policy agenda structurally sound, even after the point we've actually implemented it, that ensure that it's going to be a little bit hard for Republicans to win elections again and tear down everything and start tearing down democracy. So direct action is going to be a huge, huge part of that. And particularly if all of this fails, like, we shouldn't discount the possibility that the reforms don't happen. And so the question then becomes, what are the solutions we can look to outside of the conventional political system to get things done? I think that means turning to labor organizing, making sure that people are joining unions. That's one of the big stories of how democratic power eroded over the past several decades. So that at that point, you have to think creatively about, okay, what are the things that we can sort of do outside of this political structure that can move things forward? But this period we have now is a period to try, even if it's hopeless, even if it seems like democratic leadership is going to do the right thing. Everybody has an obligation to do as much as they can, to put as much pressure as they can on these people for the next 6 months, and really on through 2022. But I think that really within the next 6 months, we're going to know what's what and what the remaining walls really are on some of these.
I just want to point out that sort of extreme, just piggybacking on what you're saying, the extreme contrast with the beginning of the Obama administration. And OFA, Organizing for America, was founded as a way to destroy grassroots activity as independent grassroots activity, instead to put it within this controlled entity that wasn't accountable to the Democratic Party, that also wasn't directly Obama and was not local grassroots activity. And there was such love and loyalty to Obama and a very explicit structural effort to tamp down that energy. And that combination, I think, is one of the most consequential moments of silence in American democratic history, the beginning of his administration, where he was given honeymoon after honeymoon after honeymoon. And thank goodness that is not here. We have the opposite. We have a president who won not because of mass grassroots activity, so the grassroots activity is happening outside of him, and people who are not about to give a honeymoon, but putting a lot of pressure on. And we've already seen Biden move twice in the last month. We've seen him move on impeachment and on relief checks. And these are major moves. And you could debate the degree to which those come grassroots up, but I think grassroots activity has been an essential part of that shift. So I actually think that the real risk is the sort of the incredible gravitational pull of wanting to be in what seemed like a safe 2009 and 2010, which was not safe. but the grassroots activity is absolutely key. I couldn't agree with Osita more about this moment. And obviously Jeff's work has been really you've done incredible leadership at this moment in that accountability holding.
Obviously, one of the big features of the Trump era was rampant corruption in the executive branch. We're talking about the kind of like, it seems like an understatement to just talk about them as if they were ethical violations. They staged the entire last night of the Republican National Convention was a Hatch Act violation. But I'm reminded that when all of this began, even before Trump was sworn in, Walter Shaub, who was then the director of the Office of Government Ethics, was an Obama appointee. He gave a talk at the Brookings Institution. He said, the thing about government ethics is that we don't talk about them that often when they're working, because government ethics, they're like the guy he's like Tom York's guitar tech. You only notice when something's fucked up, gone wrong. Things have gone really wrong, and I think that we as a media, as the media institution writ large, have had a really hard time explaining to people why it's so bad. Like the emoluments clause, that was like a real mouthful for us to get through and explain. And I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who just don't understand why it's bad for the president to take a little backsheesh on the side if he's supposedly working for America. So I'm wondering if you guys could talk about what the Biden administration can do to make a good governance and the stamping out of, corruption and the assertion of ethical governance, I guess, sexy again, or important to people again, to make them want it more.
Jason, we've been thinking about that a lot at Revolving Door Project. And I think part of this is that we need to be simultaneously looking forward and looking back. That means that there needs to be ongoing, and in some cases, first looks of accountability for the Trump administration, even as the Biden administration tries to pick up the pieces and put together a competent government. The federal government right now is deeply, deeply broken. So many people have departed, partially of their own will, partially not of their own will. Talented people, like it's lucky that Tony Fauci, pushing 80 years old, somebody who for each of the last 30 years could have been making many millions of dollars a year from big pharma companies ever since his leadership of the FDA during the peak of AIDS in this country. We're lucky that we have Tony Fauci and some of the people we still do, but we've lost a lot of people, and we've lost them from the US Department of Agriculture to the CFPB and everywhere in between. And I think that the biggest failure, we think, of the Pelosi House Democrats was the failure to focus on what was going wrong in the executive branch. What happened in Puerto Rico such that after Hurricane Maria, the island wasn't fixed? It just catastrophic failure of the federal government that the media didn't pay that much attention to, with the exception of a handful of exceptions. And the Democratic Party didn't tell a story about this is why you need government. We had a test run for what would happen in the case of an emergency under Donald Trump as president. We saw what would happen with a corrupt and incompetent executive branch, and we didn't care. And so we started a Revolving Door Project writing articles in February about the corrupt, incompetent, and very corporate response of the Trump administration to coronavirus. We point out that Alex Azar is a big pharma lobbyist turned HHS secretary. And so what we think Biden needs to do is make government functional again, rebuild government, do so as aggressively as possible, break as many norm eggshells as is necessary to make a functioning government omelet. I don't know if I'm going to use that metaphor in the future, but the basic point being, we need a functioning government, and I think Alex Perrine wrote a great New Republic article about this a few months ago, about just how if functioning government is an area of consensus potentially between progressives and centrist Democrats. And so hopefully a Javier Becerra run HHS does a much better job on COVID response than Alex Azar. But it's going to be important that not only does Biden deliver the goods in real time, we need to tell a story about what did Trump do wrong. We should have constant congressional oversight into how Trump built out his COVID-19 response. And that contrast, I think, can make America start believing in government again and start being like, oh my God, like it really mattered that Donald Trump was president. It wasn't just about the aesthetics. It wasn't just about the light coup activity. It wasn't just about all of that. It really was day-to-day consequential.
I also think it matters that, I just basically kind of disagree with Walter Schaub's basic point there. I mean, I don't think that our anti-corruption stuff was working well before Trump came in. He's been flagrantly abusing it. But I think the way that you govern is, there's this line about the Obama administration being a scandal-free administration. Well, it's a scandal-free administration if you ignore all of the obvious scandals that were failures of governance. I think the failure to prosecute the financial crisis made a lot of people who were having a pretty hard time believe that the government just didn't work for them and cared about a bunch of other people a lot more than it cared about them, which was true. So, if that's not corruption, I don't know what is. And furthermore, the way that the Obama administration moved just very easily with corporate America. Eric Schmidt from Google was talking with Obama on election night 2012. Google was running a lot of Obama's campaign data. This is stuff that is pretty obviously inappropriate, right? Is it as inappropriate as hosting foreign dignitaries at a hotel you own? I guess not. But why do we have to choose between these things? And I think when you do things like that, you associate yourself with a wing of with a slice of the electorate that most of the electorate just doesn't identify with at all. It makes people think that the president is this sort of man of the tech barons, man of the elite, rather than of the people, and that is a damaging thing. I think Biden will have some. He will have some PR benefits. I mean, like, I think the first Black president just doesn't get cut slack the way that like Biden will. And I think Biden's sort of folksy aw shucks thing, like, I think that does kind of work with a lot of people. But if he goes around, trying to be best buddies with all these CEOs and trying to explain to people, why they're the smartest people and they're going to do the best thing, that could be really troubling for his broader agenda.
Yeah, I think a legalistic approach to anti-corruption does not work as a political matter. And that does not mean that we shouldn't be rigorous about the laws, but that they're sort of crept into elites. Something that Mark Twain talked about is how elites basically had during the Gilded Age, this kind of like, if it's legal and if everybody else is doing it, that is just the way things are. And I think just a far greater sensitivity and a non-legalistic approach, saying, no, we are fighting, again, against these fat cats, for people whose wages have been stagnant, for medium and small businesses, against this horrific, just the horrific conditions caused by this economy. All of that is really critical. And you can do it without being, and I do think this is important, and it seems like a fine line, but you can do it without being like puritanical. It's just saying, hey, major revolving door, that's a problem. Absence of big prosecutions is a problem. One thing that I just want to tease out is I think that what we're all talking about is an aggressive, serious, energetic exercise of power. And we're talking about it at the congressional level. And there have been relatively few examples of it, which is why we're talking, not just because I love antitrust, but the House Antitrust Subcommittee showed like, oh, you can actually change people's minds and do serious investigations and use it against big corporate America, and it can make a difference. Also, we're talking about actually using the laws on the books. The third area is rulemaking. And I just want to, give the folks, even I know we're on a TNR call and you guys have done great work on this, but the folks at the Prospect for laying out the sort of executive branch possibilities a long time ago in rulemaking has really been extraordinary. And the rulemaking is not extra. It's not, it is actually part of the job. And one thing I think people will be looking for when you're talking about competent government, it doesn't mean every vaccine goes to the precisely right person. It means aggressive, energetic, focused use of the powers that you have for the public good. And that does include rulemaking.
Osita, you've talked about how one of perhaps the most aggressive and energetic things Democrats need to do is disempower or abolish the GOP. But Biden, of course, ran his entire poetic campaign on the notion that there would be an epiphany when he came to power. And I think Tom Daschle was trying to keep that idea alive this week when he talked about how actually, no, you can get much more stuff done if you and Mitch McConnell are on the same page about things. Do you think that it's pretty ironic that the sort of Capitol riot actually happened on Epiphany? Those of you follow the Christmas holidays in that fashion, it was something that stuck with me. Do you get a sense now, Osita, that maybe Biden has woken up from that perhaps campaign reverie?
No, he hasn't. I mean, the thing about Biden is like, I don't actually think that Biden is a dumb man. I think that what Biden is actually doing when he says, the Republicans are going to come together and there's going to be this great moment of unity and that's how we're going to pass policy. I think that is him presenting a view of what government should work like, because he's fundamentally a policy moderate, right? Once you start conceding that, okay, that's not how government really works, you can't actually break from this model and pass anything you want, through the filibuster, through reconciliation. That for him is not the ideal policy scenario. I think he wants down the middle governance, basically. And if you can't get it now, you still tell people that that's how it works, because at a certain point, he believes the Republican Party is going to calm down. It's not going to be tomorrow, but maybe 5-10 years from now. And you're going to want that sort of model of governance to have remained in people's heads and not have gone down the crazy left path, if that makes sense. Like he's telling a story that he hopes will become true later on, so that people don't get too crazy. That's what I think that he's doing. Because I think it's very hard for me to believe that somebody who was in the Obama administration and has been in politics for as long as he has, to not understand what the lay of the landscape actually looks like. People will say, well, believes what he believes because he started in the Senate in the 1970s, and he's stuck and remained in amber in that way. That also means that he's seen politics shift and the Republican Party shift through all of that time. I don't think that he is being candid about what he actually thinks. But I do think that he thinks it's important for sort of normative reasons to present a model to the American people of what, this bipartisan, vision. I think he thinks it's important for the people to still think that's the way government should work, for a whole host of reasons. And I think it's incumbent upon us to sort of present an alternative vision, to say, no, like you can actually pass a lot of laws without 60 votes. And that's in fact how we're going to pass anything, if we're going to pass it at all. To say, no, like there have been multiple periods in American history with what is functionally full government control from one party or another. And it was only, post World War II that we had this sort of more frequent changes in government. But before that, you had long stretches where the Republican Party was in control, long stretches where the Democratic Party was in control. And that's how a lot of things got done. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But people have so, I think, deeply internalized the model of bipartisanship and the idea that everything has to be the way that was under Clinton, that's the politics a lot of people have grown up with. That's the politics a lot of people who are currently serving in government right now came up in. They remember the Clinton era, they remember the DLC, and that's how Democrats really did win during that period after Reagan. But it's incumbent upon the progressives we have elected now, to sort of present to the American people a different vision for how governance should actually work, and the idea that it doesn't necessarily mean that a policy is bad if you don't have Republican support for it. That's important thing for people to understand. I don't think the public gets it because they haven't been told a different story yet. And that's the job of political communication, I think progressive politicians have to take on.
I want to just briefly get to some questions from the audience tonight. We'll start with this, since we're talking about the Republican Party. Do any of you think that the Republican Party will ever leave Trumpism behind? And if so, what kind of force will that take to get them out of the Trumpist orbit?
I think that you're going to need to see somebody survive a Trumpist primary challenge, or maybe a few somebodies. I think that the developments in late today with Cheney's daughter, I forget if it's Liz or Lynn Cheney, coming out in favor of impeachment. That's fascinating. Like, she turned down a primary to go into the Senate to remain the #3 Republican in the House. She's ambitious. Like, there's going to be a Trumpist primary challenger in Wyoming to Cheney. How does that go? I think we really need to see primaries, and will there be geographic distinctions made? McConnell obviously would prefer a model of the Republican Party in which a figure like Susan Collins does not have to worry about a primary because she is in a light blue to purple state. And whereas he's like totally fine with, an Alabama Tommy Tuberville, so long as they don't have Roy Moore's unique problems. So I think it's about Republican primaries.
I think it depends on what you take Trumpism to actually mean. We should have arrived at a real firm definition for that word by the end of this. I'm not sure that we actually have. But if Trumpism for you is having boisterous politicians saying overtly racist things, being publicly corrupt in this kind of comical way, buffoonery, all of that, all the things that we see as characteristics of Trump himself, I think the Republican Party can leave that behind. If Trumpism is more substantively, a policy regime that privileges white wealthy people and that is bad for democracy and involves suppressing the vote and involves using the powers of government to enrich private interests. If those aspects of what Trump has done are what Trumpism is for you, then no, the Trump Party can't get rid of that, because that's just conservatism. That is just the Republican Party does. It might do it with a different, more suburbanite friendly face in 2024. It might do it with a person of color even. There are all kinds of people you can put in front of that agenda, but that core agenda is just the actual policy agenda of the Republican Party. It was there before Trump. It's going to be there after Trump. So I think that there are multiple futures that we can sort of try to sketch out for the party, and it's not really clear what they're going to follow. I do think it's remarkable that not only Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger and these people in the House are backing impeachment now, but apparently Mitch McConnell, according to the New York Times, there's a piece that came out, I think a couple of hours ago, saying that he's been telling his caucus that it's okay, that he personally thinks impeachment is the right thing, and that he's not going to, hold it against people if they vote for it. That's a remarkable shift, and it's not happening because Mitch McConnell, he listened to an angel on his shoulder and has decided to do the right thing and restore American democracy. That's a political calculation. That is him saying, look, you had all of these companies who've now said that they don't want to back people who supported this move against the election, that are very obviously now spooked by what Trumpism can become. That is a threat to Republican candidates. And that's also evidence that you can move away from this in a way that's going to be politically tenable. I don't think it's necessarily true, as people have said, that the Republican Party is now dependent upon this sort of white working class or rural and exurban real Trumpist base to win elections. I think it's entirely possible that they come to a place where they're putting forward more superficially moderate candidates. They're losing the new people that Trump brought into the Republican electorate, but they're also winning back the suburbanites that went into the Democratic Party as a consequence of Trump. So what you have is a coalition that was winning them elections from Reagan through Bush. I think it's entirely possible that they go back to that. They don't need the people who Trump brought in to win elections. You can see evidence of that here in Maryland, where Larry Hogan is governor. You can see that in Massachusetts, where Charlie Baker is governor. There's a model for them beyond Trump. It's just a matter of whether they're actually going to take it and how much of an entity Trump remains after all that's happened.
I'll offer a personal prediction that it's quite possible the future face of Trumpism will be some sort of very fashy girl boss type, someone who has classified their luggage company as a tech company and completely broken the will of her employees. To talk about, I want to talk a little bit about the national trend toward populism. Some people are asking how the move that's been engendered, perhaps under Trump, perhaps also by forces on the left, might play out in the future, and are there positives are there positives you taken from this trend? Can this movement be utilized to accomplish, say, Keynesian-esque policy reforms?
I feel like that's teed up very nicely for my book. So I will
congratulations.
That's okay. I think you have to be careful about how you use the word populism. The original 1880s, 1890s populists were advocates of multiracial democracy. They wanted to destroy corporate monopolies. They wanted to empower labor unions to take on abusive bosses. This was not a movement of cranky loons. But the idea that economic democracy and democracy more broadly can get out of hand and go wild and be something very dangerous. This is a very old concept in political theory going back to Aristotle. And I think when you look at what just happened on Capitol Hill, it's I think not easy for ordinary people to say, oh, wait, is that democracy run amok, or is that the opposite of democracy? I mean, I think for most people listening to this event, watch this event, it's pretty obvious that was the opposite of democracy. But I think what you have in Trump, and I think to some extent this gets to what Osita was talking about, if you have a Republican Party that is fundamentally oriented towards funneling money towards the rich, but also talks like it's going to make things easier for a particular working man, that is a pitch that that often works. It often is able to peel votes away from political parties that are more genuinely democratic or more genuinely populist. I mean, the populist movement in the 1880s and 1890s was dealing with these far right people trying to peel their voters away towards either, typically in the South, it was the Democratic Party, but also occasionally in the North, there were corrupt Republicans as well. So, you know, there are people who are willing to take the economic pitch without the democracy pitch. That exists, and I think, you know, for the Biden administration, the key is to do both. You know, show that you can have the democracy and you can have the good economic stuff without you know, without this doesn't somehow hurt you to have other people voting while you're getting checks in the mail as well. I mean, I do think intellectually, you know, what Osita was talking about Biden and the way he adopts a particular you know, idea about how politics ought to work in order to pursue that moderate agenda. I think that's really a sharp observation. But one crack in the armor there is the stuff about the deficit, because the deficit's been used for the last, you know, century really to say, well, it would be really nice if everybody could have nice things, but actually we just can't afford it. And Biden saying, no, we can spend trillions of dollars. That's a way of saying, look, the problem here is politics. It's actually not, it's not money or economics. You know, Biden's politics, I think, you know, it's going to take some progressive pressure to make those work out. But you do have at least that economic barrier that has been broken down.
Zephyr, I did a good question for you also. One of the members of the audience wants to know more about the power that Kamala Harris is going to have in terms of being the president of the Senate. What kind of things she can do to preside over the Senate, set agendas, and do something more than just break occasional tie votes. And also, we have someone who's wondering if you thought that Kamala Harris is going to be a big influence on the Biden administration.
Well, I'm going to actually, we have a procedural expert here in Jeff, so I'm going to turn the sort of procedural details, and others maybe as well. I am not a procedural expert on Harris. I just want to very briefly piggyback on something Zach said before we talk about Harris's role and a brief thought. I really think that the modern era begins in 2008 with the crash, and that has defined popular politics and been very confusing to many who came up during the Clinton, sort of the Clinton era, not just because of triangulation, but because of how campaigns were funded and the particular bargains that were made during that era. But that for modern politics, there's pre-crash and post-crash politics. And in post-crash politics, a deep suspicion of concentrated power of institutions that can be incredibly dangerous. I mean, there's multiple directions this distrust can go in, and that failure to engage in a serious way people's real sense of having been screwed, and then being accurate in their feeling of having been screwed and saying, somebody did this to you, and it wasn't those you know, immigrants, people of color. I don't want to repeat the things that Trump says, but, you know, very explicit racial stories about who has hurt your life. It's really important to be accurate about who is suppressing wages, and failure to engage on that is a real problem. And you will find elite financiers using the word populist as a way to scare people away from the positive, the real need for people to understand, well, what happened to me? And that's cross-racial. What happened to me? Why are jobs in my community stagnating? I am frankly, and I want to hear what Jeff talks on the procedural front. I think there's nothing more important than grassroots power on big tech, because of course Harris comes from a big tech world. And in as much as there is a person who represents what could be a block to what is politically and democratically and economically necessary, it could come in the form of Harris, but I think there's a lot we don't know.
Just briefly on the procedural grounds, I don't claim great Senate expertise, but I think her key vote will be in the organizing of the Senate, which will only occur after the Georgia senators have been seated and she has been inaugurated. At that point in time, making Senator Schumer the majority leader, they'll have to organize the Senate under very specific rules. I think the rules will be more favoring the party with the vice president in 2021 than in 2001, because honestly, being a little bit fair to Senate Democrats, in 2001 was literally the least thing the Republicans could do after stealing the 2000 election in Florida. So I think she will have to spend some time on the Hill, but I don't think she'll need to be there that often. Once the Senate is organized in a way that Senator Schumer is the majority leader, I think he will have sort of implicit control of the floor much of the time. And that doesn't mean that Vice President Harris will have the extended 10-day trips overseas that her predecessors have enjoyed, for better or for worse. And we at Revolving Door Project have been monitoring the 2020 presidential primary candidates. We monitored them and put together a tool about where their campaign funding and bundling activity came from. Harris was definitely pretty strong in Silicon Valley, but the extent to which Pete Buttigieg kind of displaced her in that space is considerable. And our sense is that Harris is a smart political operator who can follow the trajectory of the party pretty well. So I have, again, like some cautious optimism about Vice President Harris in this regard, though we definitely agree that she has to be monitored closely.
I just want to, so we're getting to the end of this tonight, and in the interest of wrapping things up, and also in the interest of, you know, helping people out there who are watching this be better informed about the sort of issues that they too can perhaps have a whip hand in driving some form of governance on, whether it's pressuring their representative or working in their community. I wanted to just go around the room and ask everyone if there's an issue, and it can be as granular as you like, that you're paying particular attention to, a problem you're paying particular attention to that you think is very important and needs to be resolved.
Just in general?
It can be in general or specific. Yeah. What are you keeping an eye on? What's like right now, sort of in the back of your mind that you'd like other people to be more aware of and perhaps be ready to sort of get out and mobilize on?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things I tend to be worried about is the possibility of the planet frying up within the next several years.
Small thing.
Yeah, that's one thing I think is a big deal. It's a big deal for reasons I don't think get fully explicated. I mean, people talk about the environmental consequences, but if you're worried about political instability in this country, I think you have to be worried about climate change. It's going to exacerbate it significantly in all kinds of complex ways. There's a great book, The Uninhabitable Earth, came out a couple of years ago, that I recommend to everybody. If there's one book I could shove into Joe Biden's hands, it would probably be this book. Sorry, Zach. Maybe your book would come second. But I think climate is a huge issue, and there are groups all over the country organizing around it. Obviously, the Sunrise Movement has gotten a lot of attention, but there are also a lot of long existing local environmental groups you could probably get involved in. But I'm very curious to see what the mix is going to be between executive action on Biden's part, which is a lot of people have already written about, and what he tries to do through the legislature, either through reconciliation or through actual formal, traditional legislation. But that, to me, is the big issue that Joe Biden's first term is going to be judged upon, if not immediately by political commentators with the next 2 years, certainly 10, 15, 20, and beyond years from now.
Just to quickly piggyback off Osita's point, Kate Aronoff has been doing tremendous reporting for you guys at the New Republic about the climate and Treasury Department and financial regulation. And these financial regulators or the Treasury Department are not used to hearing from grassroots groups. They're not used to being the subject of political mobilization. And I think that should change. And so but this will apply to any issue that you care about. Like if you actually push the executive branch and start making phone calls, and not just to the general line, but working with groups that have expertise and figuring out what the assistant secretary for X, what their phone line is, what their email is. I think you can create a sense of urgency across the executive branch, and I think it's necessary. So your issue might be like Big Ag, as Zephyr has written about, and your issue could be anything. LGBTQ plus issues, you name the issue, there is someone in the executive branch who could be making things better, and you should get in their face, even if it's virtually.
There's a lot that's been said here that I think is critical, and I do think it fits into an overarching, aggressive, positive agenda. I don't think you have to trade these off. Like actually, once you start using your muscles, it turns out your muscles get stronger. So climate sort of real shift on austerity and is critical. Clearly, and I wrote this piece that I'm very proud of for the New Republic about what Biden can do in a trust busting way, which is absolutely substantial. One thing I just want to make sure we have on the table is labor. And the executive branch has a lot of rulemaking authority in the labor arena and a lot of leadership opportunity in labor arena, and creating the conditions under which people can organize and are correctly classified. Is I think absolutely essential. It's hugely politically popular, and we haven't had a labor president. And it's an area where I think both in Congress doing investigations about the nature of modern work, so we have a better portrait of what actually the kinds of pressures workers are under. That's the kind of investigations, corporate investigations, I think we should see a lot more of. But I really think that we should be putting pressure on Biden to be a labor leader.
Mine is kind of abstract, and I don't know if you can actually get people to rally behind this thing, but you guys have already said the stuff that I would say. And that's that there's going to be a very large multi-trillion-dollar fiscal commitment from the Biden administration, and I'm almost certain it's going to pass. I think what is in that package is really important. And the $2,000 checks have become sort of this holy grail for progressives over the last couple months, because it's been something that seemed like it was maybe achievable because President Trump was pushing for them. And $2,000 checks are great. I'm in favor of $2,000 checks. But the thing that the US economy really, really badly needs is public investment. And public investment is just a fancy way of saying actual stuff, not just turning over money to you so you have something to spend, but actually building things that do productive work in the United States. Whether it's a national park or a factory, we don't do a lot of public investment anymore, even though the government has a fairly high percentage of GDP. The government can take credit for that. What happens when you don't have a lot of public investment is that you also don't get a lot of private investment. And so if you look at all of the corporate so-called innovation that we've seen over the past 20, 25 years, it's in stuff that doesn't actually do much of anything. It's stuff like Uber and ride sharing that is just playing regulatory games and arbitraging different states and their regulations against each other. And what we've seen very clearly is that the private sector just doesn't do the big investment stuff that creates big, healthy economies. And so if the federal government is not willing to do that, what's going to happen is that in a few years, we'll be back to the same point, and people will say, what the Biden administration did was spend all this money and I'm still screwed. I like fascism now. And we're kind of running out of space between like total fascism and kind of fascism in the United States. So I do think a big kind of New Deal style public investment regime needs to be something that the Biden administration takes seriously. And we have so many things that we need to spend money on, not just roads and bridges. I mean, our healthcare infrastructure obviously doesn't freaking work, right? I mean, the COVID pandemic has made that very clear. And you can get through so much stuff under the banner of the pandemic because just making society work well makes it easier to fight the pandemic. So public investment.
And I'll answer the question. There's a lot of things I'm paying attention to. I'm paying attention to the possibility of robust antitrust and anti-monopoly action in agriculture, because Democrats need to take every opportunity to sort of like break bread with rural voters. I'm also really concerned about the gig economy. We've seen Prop 22 out in California already have this terrible effect on labor out there. This is a bill that was passed with a lot of Democratic DNA attached to it. So it's a worrisome thing for me. But over the past few weeks, we've been having a sort of debate about the $2,000 checks and the $600 sweetener that was part of the UI benefit. Which should we use? Which should we have? The UI benefit, I will say, was an extremely effective anti-poverty program that Congress almost accidentally created. To my mind, I say it's not an either or choice. I'm a both and guy. Go read The Deficit Myth, learn something about modern monetary theory. And I'll just point out to people out there listening that poll after poll after poll shows that none of you really give a shit about the debt or deficit. It's not an issue that shows up in your top 5 concerns. And yet the media very much wants the world to believe that it's something that you, the people, care a lot about when you don't. So when you see deficit hackery popping up in the world, smack it down. It's the only way we'll get it to go away. So tonight I'd like to just sign off by thanking our guests, Zach, Zephyr, Jeff, Osita. If you look in the chat, you'll be able to see how you can follow them on Twitter. I think we've put every single book they've written in there, or recently anyway. All of you should tweet the books you wrote immediately.
Zephyr's book is great. She hasn't got enough shout outs. Break Them Up is awesome.
Yeah. I want everyone to think, I just want to thank everybody again for joining us tonight. I know we've had a lot of people there, and I know this has been a big discussion. We could go on for another hour. Maybe sometime in the future, we'll have a chance to come back and review where we got to. But next Tuesday, I'd like to invite everyone to join TNR once again, when my colleague, Katie McDonough, who's the deputy editor of the Sold Short section on our website, will be presenting a live stream titled Saving Our Politics from the Ground Up. She'll be joined by Chase Strangio from the ACLU and LA City Councilwoman Nithya Raman. You can sign up for this on newrepublic.com's event page. And if you'd like to keep up with my section on the New Republic, the Soapbox, please sign up for the Power Mad newsletter. I believe that we've already dropped a link in the chat there. It's free, so come get some free stuff I made for you and see how you like what we're doing at New Republic. For all of us here at TNR, for my guests, I want to just once again express my extreme gratitude that you all joined us today. It has been a lovely opportunity and a great discussion. I've really enjoyed having you in my home. I hope that tomorrow we can continue the work of building a home for each other. Good night. For the New Republic, I'm Jason Linkins.